Very well, thank you very much, Natalie. So many books have been written, articles and commentaries, as Paul Craig said before me, about the constitutional crisis in Poland, which is the topic of my paper. Now, as we know in the media, much of the discussion focused on the tensions between the Polish government and the Law and Justice Party and EU institutions. Academics have analyzed this crisis through different lenses. On the one hand, political scientists have examined the rise of populist conservative parties to shed light on the unpredicted democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. And here, Jan Zielonka argued that what is happening in the region, not only in Poland, but also in other countries, is a contest between the winners of the post-1989 transformation and those who seek to dismantle the political order established after the collapse of communism. On the other hand, and it is important to combine the two literature, we have scholars in law who focused on the assault on liberal constitutionalism. And for some of them, the Polish constitutional crisis encapsulates a confrontation between two understandings of constitutionalism: legal constitutionalism and political constitutionalism. Regardless of the perspective and the disciplinary lenses, sovereignty is repeatedly mentioned in this growing debate, in this body of research, but I think it is not really examined per se. So since this paper is a contribution to this project, Conflict of Sovereignty in the European Union, the aim was here to examine the Polish case from the point of view of the sovereignty debate. So you will, what the paper tries to see is to understand how and why a domestic conflict between law and justice transforms itself into a conflict of sovereignty in the EU polity. So that would be the main question to which I will try to respond in these very 10 minutes that I have. So the paper, which is still a draft, follows the main argument of the conceptual paper that Chris presented in the first paper, in the first panel. And the argument and the ambition is to go beyond the common notion in EU studies of a conflict between national and supranational sovereignty, and to argue that underneath this appearance, there is actually a conflict between different claims to sovereignty at the national level itself, with, of course, as Paul Craig said, with, of course, implications for normative, legal and political debates about sovereignty at the EU level. So in terms of empirics, so this is a paper which analyzes a set of parliamentary debates in Poland, which were translated, covering the periods 2015-2019, and also a set of declarations of the ruling party, Law and Justice, or both members of the parliament and members of the executive, all the debates invoking the concept of sovereignty in order to legitimize, as I said before, the dismantling of the political order established after 1989. So the paper is organized in four main parts. One is about the concept. After this discussion of the concept, then there is a section in which I follow a historical approach, and the aim here was maybe unsuccessful, but to trace the origins of the conflict between the main branches of power in Poland since the adoption of the first constitution, and by the same token to see also what are the meanings attributed in the Polish political debate to this concept of sovereignty. So in section 3, I review very briefly what we all know for this constitutional crisis in 2015, and then there is a part in which I analyzed the data that I had in order to show how sovereignty is used instrumentally by the ruling party, how this concept is used for undemocratic purposes, how this concept is pitted against the supremacy of the constitution temporarily, and also against the ideal of a shared sovereignty at the EU level. So I think, but again, you will see similarities with what was said before in the conceptual paper in the first panel, is that this case is good in order to see who from the executive, parliament and courts perform the most legitimate representation of the people, and about who from the main branches of power shall have the last word over key political conflicts and constitutional settlements in a context of democratic backsliding. So allow me now to say a few words about each section of the paper. So in the first one, there is this review of this very well-established literature on sovereignty. The concept is old, the concept is disputed also, historically and socially constructed. We also see that its understanding is plural, depending on the context, international context, for the definition of what Jan Zielonka mentioned before, external sovereignty, and also depending also on domestic situations. It is also interesting to situate the concept in its historical context and to see how claims to sovereignty shaped the process of state formation, and then intellectual debates at the EU level about how to reconstruct sovereignty beyond the states, and more recently, how the concept is invoked by a variety of parties, populist parties, but not only populist parties, invoked in order to as a reaction to the transformation of the European Union over the last decades. So again, this is a well-established literature. It is very difficult to contribute to this debate, but still, when I was reading this body of research, two main questions were interesting for me in order to structure the analysis of the Polish case, and in order to structure any analysis related to conflicts of sovereignty in the EU. So the questions were: who should represent the people, and where should sovereignty be institutionally located, and also, of course, how to solve conflicts. So this was a bit the aim of the paper, to see how the literature helps us to respond to those questions. So following these two dimensions, the aim was to grasp the variety of meanings attributed to popular sovereignty, national sovereignty, state sovereignty, and also to see how is this concept institutionally located in different contexts, be it the sovereignty of the parliament. So in some constitutional tradition, there is the sovereignty of the parliament, which is emphasized, while in other tradition, it is said to be that sovereignty is said to be reside in the constitution. And then again, the same debate, but about sovereignty beyond the state, with another very rich body of research pointing out that the EU legal order is inconsistent with the sovereignty of the parliament, because there is no European demos. We have demoi, as Kalypso Nikolaidis said. And then again, in this body of research about sovereignty beyond the state, this new paradigm, which was proposed by several scholars, this idea of constitutional pluralism as a way to describe a non-hierarchical relationship between legal orders, because this question of how to solve conflict remain even in this body of research. Then moving to the next part of the paper, so this section 2 traces the origins of the sovereignty debate in Poland, and here the focus was to see the understandings of the sovereignty of the nation and the sovereignty of the state. But what was important for me was to see also the role of the judicial institutions, which has oscillated between political subordination and independence. I don't have time to elaborate more on this part. And then in the third section, there is a summary of what you already know, the Polish constitutional crisis and those conflicts between different branches of power about the nomination of judges, members of the Constitutional Court, with this timeline and a set of steps, in particular in the period 2015. But we know that this crisis and disempowerment of the court continued after 2015. So this section summarizes what happened, the narrative of the crisis, where we can see that different actors can have different ways to, tell this narrative and to point a specific origin of the problem. And last, that would be my slide. I will try to say a few words about the data analysis. So this part was about how the ruling party understands the concept of sovereignty. And here the empirical analysis was structured around the main questions that I discussed before in the theoretical part. First, what we see is that the members of the ruling party embrace morality. It is very, very strong in the discourses, morality claims, moral feelings, which echo the language of Polish identity, dignity, and pride. Then sovereignty is often associated with the ideals of independence, freedom, autonomy, the capacity to decide, the ability of the state to control the actors and activities within and across the borders. And then why is also part of this very strong narrative with two main ideas. I aim to regain sovereignty in relation with the EU, but also this aim of restoring a strong state. And the most important part of the discussion and the analysis is to be done is how to realize the principle of sovereignty. And here again, in the debates and declarations, we see this overemphasis of the will of the people, but the will of the people in most of the declaration is the people, which is the electorate, the constituency of the party. So there is indeed this focus on the parliament and the people, the parliament as an ultimate loci of power, which in reality is about the majority of the party in the parliament. And last but not least, this is also another tension and another conflict, which is about the tension between the representatives of the government and parts of the legislature, which are against the dominant language of constitutional democracy. And here there is all the support that the party receives from legal scholars, Polish legal scholars, who support this discourse of peace about state sovereignty in relation with the European Union. So a discourse rejecting temporarily the supremacy of the constitution. And this understanding of sovereignty should guide the relation with the EU. I'm afraid I don't have time to elaborate a bit more, but just to conclude with this part, which is the declaration this week. Paul Craig mentioned the discussions and negotiations at the EU level about the recovery plan, and here is a declaration by the Minister of Justice saying that this is an issue that will determine if Poland is a sovereign subject in the EU community. So this is just to conclude, and I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.